For those that might have been eavesdropping downstairs, we said downstairs about 10 minutes, upstairs about 20, 25 minutes. So I managed to write 2 completely different presentations with strands of thought, and then having spent hours on it as we came upstairs, we said, oh, just do the one you did downstairs. But no, I am going to do the one that I did upstairs, which is the slightly longer version. But if it gets boring, I can revert to the shorter version, we'll just give up and have the main course. Anyway, Denis is very kindly filming it, but you're not going to film the opening part because I've signed a non-disparagement agreement with the person I'm about to tell the story about. So if you could just not tweet the first part and then we'll kick off. But in fact, the book is called Trust Me, PR is Dead. And I actually do want to talk more about trust than PR. And the reasons will become quite clear. But the brief from Louise was actually, there was a line in the book which was the only agency we need is change. And when Louise first got in touch, she said, could you talk about that? The only agency we need is change. And it was a pun, really, because I used to run Europe, the Middle East and Africa for the world's largest public relations agency. So it was my way of saying the only agency we really need is change. And that is because actually the PR agency model, like the business model of many professional services firms, I think is completely broken. I also think, when it comes to PR is dead, that the philosophy, such as it is also busted. And I wanted to start by telling the story of why I decided to quit my very highly paid job with lots of perks and long-term incentive plans to give up and write a book. Although actually this book wasn't in my head when I quit. So that's the Edelman story. But the point there is the only agency I felt we need is change, because we want to talk about trust and what it takes to be trusted and what it takes to do the right thing, and doing the right thing will be a big theme of the next 23 minutes. That is something that we need to think about. So I have this fascination with trust in business, trust in politics, trust in society, and I've spent a lot of my professional career, certainly in the past 10 years or so, thinking about what trust really means, how it works, and what a progressive future looks like. And this is why I arrived at where I did, that when it comes to consulting PR, when it comes to consulting in PR, PR has been part of the problem, the trust problem, and I don't believe as it's currently constructed, it's part of the trust solution. How many people here are familiar with the travel company Thomas Cook? Right, so some are. Okay, so for a quick recount, large UK travel operator, those that held their hands up, probably aware of the scandal that it's recently been involved in, where 2 years ago, tragically, 2 young children died at one of its properties in Corfu in Greece. There was the family asked the company for an apology. The company never gave the apology. There was an investigation into it, and it turned out that Thomas Cook received a payment of 3.5 million sterling, 5 million euros, from the hotel operator, but did not pass that money on to the family. Pocketed the money and still didn't say sorry to the family of the 2 dead children. Now that's a scandal that a lot of people have talked about. This is from the Thomas Cook website. We act with integrity. We maintain the highest ethical standards and transparency in our work, in our dealings with customers, partners, stakeholders, and fellow employees. We keep our commitments. We are honest, fair, and trustworthy. That is the sort of PR bullshit that we need to call bullshit on, just as a civilized group of human beings that should not accept that sort of behavior. And in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, a journalist took me to task and said, actually, what's happened at Thomas Cook is exactly why we need more PR. And the point about the Thomas Cook episode was that wasn't a communications failure. That was a substantive failure. That was an absolute failure in behaviour and ethics. And so we've got into this world where people believe that they can spin their way out of anything. They can craft a narrative, they can land their story, all sorts of cliches that you hear. But if you fail to do the right thing, I believe that you have to be held to account. So when people start talking about low levels of trust in business, when you have organisations, and there are other stories like this as we go through this, but when you have organisations like Thomas Cook behaving the way they did, why should we trust them? And they're really not alone. Increasingly, I have always felt that the crisis of trust, which we hear about a lot in politics and in business, is a crisis of leadership. And as I said, I spent the best part of 6 or 7 years co-authoring the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is unveiled with great fanfare at Davos every year. But I was never very happy with what it was doing, because it wasn't really asking questions of trust. It was effectively a sales tool. And it had very clunky measurements. So trust in the US was up, trust in business was flat, trust in politicians in China was down. Actually, it was never down, because then you lost your license to operate if you said that, so you said something different. And these were sort of incredibly imperfect and imprecise, very clunky scores. The point is that there's no point trying to measure trust, because actually we live in a world where trust is in permanent flux. The world has changed, and we'll look at some of the ways the world has changed. But in this new world, we have to rethink new ideas around trust and how they work. And if you do that, you have to then begin to challenge and think through different business models and different orthodoxies. That's why I challenged the business model of the company for which I worked, and that's why I'd encourage everyone to rethink, not just is our philosophy right, but is our operating model right also. The most important thing when it comes to trust is that people like Thomas Cook or like that Financial Times journalist keep on thinking that trust is a message. If you say trust often enough, people will believe you. But people see what we see, and people see those just as the meaningless words that they are. And I have a sort of untested theory that the more you speak about trust, the less you actually deserve to earn it. I would quite happily ban the T word from the language for a while. So if trust is an outcome and not a message, it means that organisations have to behave differently if they're to be more trusted. You can't use words to get yourself out of a mess. And I think that leaders need to stop thinking these and spewing these endless platitudes about trust. One of the people that features in my book is a guy called Tom Fletcher. And Tom is Her Majesty, Her Britannic Majesty's ambassador to Lebanon. And for those of you who are either British or involved with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, you'll know that this is not the most progressive establishment in the firmament of organisations. It really represents a lot of the traditions that probably hold Britain back as a country quite a lot. Anyway, I won't go into a rant about either the Foreign Office or the monarchy, because that will go on forever. But Tom read, he's the ambassador to Lebanon, and he read a blog post that I wrote called something around PR is dead. And he said, actually, this made me write. I've never met Tom, even though he's written in my book now. And he wrote a blog post called If PR is Dead, Diplomacy is Certainly Dead Too. He said, diplomacy, like PR, was born in a redundant age. It was born in 1815, in an age of monarchies and great states. And much of its form, communiques, summits, are completely irrelevant today. And actually, it just diplomacy spews meaningless platitudes. And so just as PR spews meaningless platitudes, so does diplomacy too. He goes on to write, in an age of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, quite frankly, we're much less trusted than where we were. And here's a man at the heart of the British establishment saying, if diplomacy is to survive, it needs to be more activist, more insurgent, more citizen in style, and therefore it can be more diplomatic. And I think we have to ask ourselves if business is yet as activist, as an insurgent, as Tom Fletcher would want it to be, or whether business still sits within this hierarchy and this command and control philosophy. And I'll go back to what I was saying about one of the existential threats to PR, and that's because ultimately it always seeking to get to a finite point, to manufacture the result, to get to a happy ending, a conclusion which suits the people at the top of the hierarchy. One of the challenges that Louise set me was to bring out some themes, but not too many themes, within the course of this talk. But within this sort of problem that we have around trust and the problem that we have around PR, I think is really a problem that we have around leadership. I said before that the crisis of trust is a crisis of leadership. And part of this is because we continually confuse management and leadership. Professor John Casas is really much more erudite than I am on this, and you should go online and look at his Harvard Business Review blogs on it, because in 800 words he's brilliant. But he says, you know, management is still not leadership. Leadership within management, you need hierarchy, you need a degree of sort of functionality of process in order to get things done. But leadership is where the big changes happen, and big changes don't happen in hierarchies; they happen in networks. So think about those Tom Fletcher words about activist, insurgent, citizen-style diplomacy. And I think where we've ended up, which is why Thomas Cook ended up not apologising, is that we've ended up in this risk-averse managerial culture, which is actually way too much governed in business by lawyers who don't want you to apologise because that exposes you to risk, or PR people who think, well, actually, if we craft the narrative and manage the message, we can spin your way out of trouble. But this is nonsense, because the real world, the world that's changed, doesn't look like this. But with too many lawyers and PR people surrounding us, we sort of end up being terrified of doing the wrong thing. In fact, we become so scared of doing the wrong thing that we forget that we're meant to be doing the right thing. And that leads us into a bit of a mess. And in doing that, we completely lose sight of our judgment, because we get governed by process, we get governed by managerialism, we get governed by a compliance culture, and we forget where are our values, where is our intrinsic humanity in what we say and do. So I believe that the trustworthy organisation of the future is not the one that stands up and makes speeches about trust, but it's one that actually adds an ethical dimension to the way that it behaves, because compliance alone is not enough. And going back to that Thomas Cook example, saying sorry, as we'll come on to look at, is one of the most fundamental points about trustworthiness. So there are two men called Edward I'd quite like to bring into the conversation at this point. One you're probably all familiar with, which is Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, and the other is a guy called Edward Bernays. Anyone know who Edward Bernays is? Was? So Phillips does. So Edward Bernays is often seen as the godfather of modern public relations. Not being a godfather, he was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he went to America, it's a true story, he went to America, and in the 30s he came up with this idea about public relations. The genesis of public relations is really quite terrifying. Bernays had a theory that we should not trust the democratic will of the masses. So public relations as an industry was created to control that democratic will. And that's how it grew up, out of the 30s, through the wartime propaganda, and that's why you end up with lots of people telling you that tobacco and alcohol are good for you in the 50s, because it was a way, basically, of giving a panacea to the masses. And that lack of trust in democratic judgment, in the will of the people, especially in a networked age, especially in an age of social media, just seems completely crazy. And that's really one of the most fundamental reasons why PR, as originally constructed, is no longer fit for purpose, because the truth is we do live in an age of Edward Snowden and we do not live in an age of Edward Bernays. And actually within that, no one is in control. The point about this sort of chaotic age in which we work is no one is in control and no one can impose the future. One of the stories I like to tell is a presentation I gave a couple of years ago to the European Roundtable. The European Roundtable, as many of you probably know, are the 50 largest manufacturing companies in Europe. And the theme was "You are no longer in control," which was ironic because I was following Mario Monti, who just talked about the Italian financial crisis. And there were 44 of these 50 CEOs present. At the end of following similar themes that I'm following this evening, one of the CEOs literally started jabbing his finger at me and said, "What you don't understand, Robert, is I pay people like you to keep me in control." And I was like thinking about how do I respond to this? And then one of the other CEOs, interestingly, of a tech company, manufacturing one, I want to be kept in control, tech company, popped up and said, "You can pay Robert as much as you like. The game's over. The game's up. We are no longer in control. Get used to it." Why are we no longer in control? Because what's going on in this world, as we see every day, and as Tom Fletcher beautifully articulated, is a mega trend which is all about individual empowerment. This is not me spotting the mega trend, this is the National Intelligence Agency of the United States saying this is the biggest thing that will change our lives over the next 10 to 15 years. And within this mega trend of individual empowerment, we see these power shifts going on. The shift of power from state to citizen, the shift of power from employer to employee, the shift of power from corporation to citizen consumer. So any organisation that thinks it can use either lawyers or PR people to prop up its control whilst the sort of megatrend is going on, accelerated by technology, fueled by costless communications, is clearly living in the wrong century. They're living in the century of Edward Bernays, not of Edward Snowden. And this really affects all institutions. In my home country or market of the UK, you see it with the crisis in politics. The Labour Party is sort of stuck in the mid-20th century and probably will never win power again if it doesn't change its institutional framework. The BBC, our broadcaster, is suffering from the same. And obviously there are comments and criticisms that come towards the European Union and the Commission specifically. But within this megatrend of individual empowerment, the result of no one being in control is pretty chaotic. It's pretty complex, it's interdependent and networked, and pretty chaotic. So there are 3 points that I would make following on from that observation. The first is that trusted leaders will embrace the chaos and they will navigate the complexity. And going back to my Edelman experience, I came up with this, because apart from running the European business, I was responsible for thinking through future strategies. I said to the global board, I did a presentation which is called Navigate the Chaos, or no, Embrace the Chaos, Embrace the Chaos. And there's this silence. We can't say that, Robert. Well, why not? The world's chaotic. Yeah, we know that. Well, then we should embrace it. No, we can't do that. Clients don't like chaos. Clients like simplicity. We need to sell them simple solutions. It's like, yeah, but there aren't simple solutions because the world's really complicated. Yeah, but that's not what we should sell them. So again, there's that trade-off between trying to simplify the message, trying to use PR to manufacture it to points to the happy ending, rather than actually understand that it's really complex and chaotic. So I go back to what I was saying about the European Roundtable. Trusted leaders need to accept that they're no longer in control, and they need to therefore embrace the chaos. The other thing that you often hear is that CSR is the answer. If you think I hate PR, get me on the subject of CSR. CSR sits halfway between PR and the British monarchy as to what's wrong with everything in the world today. So CSR, corporate social responsibility, has been kidnapped, right, by the PR and marketing industries and become something that should, instead of something that should have been genuinely values-led and system-centric, has just become an industry of compliance. It's one of the most hideous deceits in modern business history. My favourite but not favourite story is a call that I received after one of the tragedies in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and the garment workers. Remember, there were two things. There was a fire and then there was a building collapse. And after the fire, I got a call from the CEO of a big global corporation. He said, Robert, you need to help me. I'm getting terrible grief from my chairman. This was within 24, maybe 48 hours of the fire, which killed 100 women garment workers who were locked into the building because they couldn't get out during the daytime. He said, my chairman is giving me grief. So what do you mean he's giving you grief? So, well, he's telling me that we're not flaunting our CSR credentials well enough. People are giving us bad coverage. We've invested all this money in education programs in Bangladesh. Why aren't we telling that story? What should I tell my chairman? I said, tell him to go fuck himself. Anyway, to be fair to the CEO, he agreed. He didn't agree to do the execute that part of it, but he did agree at the principle. And this is a true story. And what we did with the CEO and I working together is we put people on the ground. We obviously provided whatever was needed for families and assistance and medical aid and so on, which was the right thing to do. But people completely have lost sight of doing the right thing and become obsessed about their corporate reputation. They think that somehow they can shield it from the truth. Another story, the F word appears a lot, I just realised in this talk, but another story, which is a true story, is a FTSE 100 CEO when I was researching the book. When his board director said, do you know X that's been redacted? There are lots of legal redactions in the book. Do you know how the board meetings of this FTSE 100 financial services company used to start? No, I said. The CEO used to come in, sit down, and say, right, who do we fuck today? And we wonder why the financial services and banking sector is in the mess that it's in, right? That is a CEO of a major firm. Whilst we're on the subject of banking and financial services, the third point I'd like to make about how we deal with this new world is that having principles is absolutely useless if we don't have the behaviours to match those principles, right? So about 2 or 3 years ago, I was called in to see the CEO of a large UK bank, shall remain nameless. And he was great. He said, look, Robert, you have to understand, I've been in banking for 30 years. I am institutionally blind on an industrial scale, which I thought was a nice piece of self-awareness. He said, but what I want you to do is I want you to help me become, or help the bank become good, trusted, and ethical. Can you help me? So I said, sure. So I went away, did some thinking, did some research. Quite frankly, nothing that I suggested was rocket science. You just need to be a normal human being and live in the real world to understand what to do. And I went back to him with these 10 principles and 10 behaviours. I won't go through all of them. I'll go through maybe 2 or 3. First principle was transparency. If you want to be good, trusted, and ethical, you need to be transparent. I love transparency, he said. We are transparent. Yep, I'm on board. Okay, great. So shall we abolish free banking? He said, well, why would we do that? I said, because it's not transparent. Because clearly you're making money out of somebody somewhere, nothing's free in life. He goes, we can't abolish free banking. I said, why? He said, because we make too much money out of it. Okay, put that to one side. Second principle was about proportionality. You know, how much you earn at the top of the organisation, how much you earn lower down. Great principle, I buy that. We're into proportionality. Okay, so should we abolish bankers' bonuses? We can't do that. Why not? They say, well, flight of talent, you know, all the usual crazy things. Flight of talent will lose our best people. And I went, but they're not proportionate. You just said you believe in proportionality. That's not, that's not what I mean by proportionality. What do you mean by proportionality? And it's crazy, crazy things. Third one was about mutuality. And by the way, he'd said that Handelsbanken, Swedish bank, which doesn't have crazy bonuses, was his most admired institution. So they managed to do it. You know, how come you can't? Third one was about mutuality. Well, let's give some shares to the people who work in this bank. We can't do that. Far too complicated. Anyway, we went through these 10 principles and 10 behaviours. He agreed with every single principle and refused to enact any of the behaviours. And at the end, he said, this has been the most great, really illuminating session. Love working with you. Really look forward to working with you in the future. It's like, I'm not working with you. And he went, why not? I said, because having principles without behaviours is pointless. It's got to be about what you do, not what you say. It's got to be about actions, not words, which really runs to the heart of what the book is all about. So I just remembered actually whilst I was talking, what crazy sidebar on that bank conversation. At the same time, they had an advertising agency and hundreds of marketing agencies working on, you know, what the new look bank should look like. It's the reborn bank. Yes. And they presented this thing and said, we've cracked the trust issue. Great, because I've been thinking about proportionality and mutuality and transparency. So they did this presentation. The first presentation was, we're going to remove the chains on the pens. And so we can show that we trust people more not to steal our pens. So you're going to restore trust in the banking sector by removing the pen chains that you put back after you fill out your forms. Yeah, we think it's a great idea. Anyway, the world's gone mad. The point is that this revolution that's happening, that I've been talking about, this mega trend of individual empowerment, is actually happening in the workplace too. You're probably all familiar with Charles Handy, the management writer, just published it in his mid-80s now, The Second Curve, which is a brilliant book. And Charles said to me, gave me this great statistic, he said, Robert, latest data, 80% of people in an organisation are not engaged and don't care. It's pretty depressing, right? 80% of employees in an organisation are not engaged and don't care, but 25% of them would actively sabotage the organisation which they work. So this revolution is happening in the workplace as well. And what we see is those same hierarchies that even the Foreign and Commonwealth Office realised don't work, and organisations like Thomas Cook and the banks realised don't work. These hierarchies are being flattened. Elites are basically being eroded one by one. And my point to lots of business leaders that I counsel, unbelievably, I still get asked to do work, even though I'm tearing each industry apart bit by bit. But I work with a lot of FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies, and the really smart ones are recognising that the world has changed, the world of work and the world outside work, and they're getting ahead of the curve rather than staying behind it. But the point is that in the workplace, whistleblowers, social media campaigns are all going on. I got asked downstairs, how do I get the organisation that's so hierarchical to get involved with social media? To which my answer was, they're already involved with social media, they just don't realise it. So how many people go on glassdoor.com or ratemyboss.com and write or blog about what they really think about their employer? How many people put it on their Facebook post? How many people tweet about it? How many people write about it on Snapchat or share it on WhatsApp? So actually, the enlightened, more trusted business leader is one that gets with that rather than goes against it. The point is about employees is that they see what all of us see. You know, I had this great conversation with Matt Peacock, who's the global head of comms at Vodafone yesterday. He said, the point in all of this is if your CEO is a tosser, everyone sees he's a tosser. And I think there's something quite important in that, and that resistance is futile. So stop trying to fight it. So what does a successful organisation in the future look like? I think it is more open. I think it is more empathetic. I think it is more relational. I also think it's more creative and it's more adaptive. And I know that some of you were here when Margaret Heffernan, who's a good friend and I think a brilliant, brilliant author, spoke earlier in the year. And I think she summed it all up. You know, the bigger prize lies in collaboration, not competition. I think that's the future of the organisation. So in my journey to writing this book, I've encountered many really interesting people, and actually one of the nicest things that a couple of people said to me says they just really enjoyed reading it, because it's not like any other business book, because you can actually read it. And actually it's quite funny in parts. But on the journey to writing the book, I heard the worst speech on trust I've ever heard any CEO give, right? And his name is Vincent de Rivaz. He features in the book, although he's probably not thrilled at it. And he's the CEO of EDF Energy. And he gave this speech in the winter of 2013-2014, which in the UK was a very cold winter, and people really weren't sure whether they could afford to eat or heat, because energy prices were going up. And I went to the Sustainability Forum, and Vincent was the keynote speaker, and his subject was trust. And on the way in, I met someone who very proudly told me that Vincent hadn't read the speech he was about to give on trust. And the reason that this person knew that is because the person had written it and handed it to Vincent in the back of the taxi on the way there. Now, as a reformed or in recovery former PR person, we've all done that. We've all written the speech and handed the speech, but this was on trust. And Vincent sort of stumbled on stage, probably with a very bright light shining at him like that, and said, if I'd taken the speech away, I felt like running on stage, just whipping it away and going, aha, what are you going to say now? And he said, it's very important that we trust our customers, that our customers trust us, that trust is central to our business. Trust is very important to the energy sector. The energy sector, it's just bullshit. I mean, it was just complete and utter bullshit. I think even Vincent realised it was bullshit. But there he was, the CEO, speaking to a sustainability forum about trust. So what can we learn about Vincent's platitudes and banalities? Exactly what Tom Fletcher was describing about sort of old form summits and communiques. What we can learn, first of all, that trust is not a message, right? So for however often Vincent said we should trust him, we really weren't going to. Because at the end of the day, EDF was screwing old people and poor people in their homes who couldn't afford to heat their homes in the heart of winter. He didn't mention them in his speech. Trust is not a message, it's an outcome, it's deeply behavioural, it's what you do, not what you say. Secondly, whatever Vincent would like us to believe, that suddenly you'd wave this magic wand or fire a silver bullet, there is no magic wand, there is no silver bullet, because in this complex world, which is very fragile, where everything happens at such speed, where you can go up and down in reputation within literally a matter of minutes, trust has to be hard fought, hard won, hard earned every day. So however much Vincent would like there to be this sort of simple formula, there isn't one. And within this fragility, it also means that there is no return to old trust. I think it's one of the biggest myths of trust, that somehow that will come out of the current crisis, whether the crisis in the Eurozone or the crisis in the banking sector or the crisis with immigration, and suddenly that we'll return to old trust. This is nonsense. We live in 2015. We live in an age of individual empowerment. We live in an age of technology. There is no return to old trust, and we need to get used to it. So going back to the question about change agency and why the only agency we need is change, what does the new model look like? It would be very easy to have written a book that was entirely critical of everything that's going on without trying to find solutions to the problems. And I'm very open in the book that I don't know whether these are the right solutions. I'm just trying to have a go at starting a conversation about what these are. So I think there needs to be a new model of public leadership. And Tom Fletcher in his blog caught some of those ideas. I think public leadership should replace public relations as the way that we lead our businesses. And that's based on four pillars. It's based on being being activist, on being co-produced, on being citizen-centric, and society first. It means that as businesses, we really do need to walk the walk and put purpose before profit, not in a nonsense CSR way, but truly put purpose at the heart of the organisation. And in defining purpose, we need to root that in the common good. And I'll come back and look at what I mean by common good, because that can be a polarising term. I also think that within this model of trusted public leadership, if you think about an activist leader, so I believe the CEO needs to think and behave much more like a social activist than he or she does as a chief executive, commanding and controlling in traditional ways. So if diplomats are insurgents, CEOs are social activists. And that means that we begin to think of the organisation not as a corporation, not as a hierarchy, not as a superstructure, not as a financially liquid legal entity with no real values because it's just a construct, but actually as real people, a bunch of real people as a social movement. The CEO is social activist, organisation, social movement. And within that, the CEO actually is accountable to wise crowds of real people. People like you and me. You know, people who are their employees or their customers or their policymakers or whatever it happens to be. So this then speaks to the point that actually we are leading ourselves astray when we obsess the whole time about measurement. What we need to think about is accountability. And the trusted leader is the one that is accountable to the organisation that he or she serves. So on that point of purpose and profit, I do believe there is a difference between profit optimisation, which I think is acceptable, and profit maximisation, which I think is unacceptable. And I'm very clear in the book that I'm not an anti-capitalist. I do believe in the pursuit of profit, but there is the right profit. You know the right profit when you see the right profit. It is possible to balance profit and purpose and to do the right thing. And any CEO who opens a board meeting with a who do we fuck today question, quite frankly, has no real role in the future of business. There is also, as I've just said, this clear difference between accountability and measurement. And what I would like to see is organisations moving to co-produce manifestos with their employees and their customers. What do we stand for? What do we want to do together? And then going back every 3 months, every 6 months, every 9 months, every 12 months on a journey, a continual journey, a journey of permanent engagement, saying, how are we doing against what we agreed? Because, of course, the current construct is that people go to their ad agencies, their PR agencies, they sit in boardrooms and goes, these are our values. You know, RBS still has integrity and mutuality emblazoned above the reception in its head office. So they go in and come up with these sort of crazy values that mean nothing because they're not rooted in real people or real lives. And I think the people that turn to wise crowds and make themselves accountable wise crowds will make better ethical and more trusted decision making, will speak to the 99%, not the 91%. And one quick statistical fact on that. Is everyone familiar with the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? So in that TV show, you have various options. If you answer the question yourself, you've got a 25% chance of getting the answer right. If you phone a friend, I think it rises to about 60%. But if you ask the audience, it's 91%. So there's something interesting in there. So Occupy say, we are the 99%. I think they missed a trick. They should say, we are the 91%, because then that would be more statistically relevant. Anyway, so who is doing this well? Well, the usual poster children. Paul Polman at Unilever is often held up as the sort of at the vanguard of the corporate revolution. Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, the US clothing manufacturer, very famously put out an ad saying, do not buy this jacket. The B corporations. But it's all over the world where these things are happening, where co-production is happening. Brazil's second largest municipality of Porto Alegre has had participatory budgeting for years. One of Spain's largest organisations, Mondragon, has 80,000 cooperatively funded employees. HCL Technologies in India co-produces its business plan. So there are glimmers of hope, and what we need to do is try and marshal that energy, marshal that hope, and put them into more sustainable business models for more people. But I think the problem in all of this is there is actually a deep political and philosophical divide that we have yet to reconcile, and that is the ghost of Milton Friedman. And the whole idea of profit maximisation, and the only purpose of business is to maximise shareholder value, still stalks us all. And until we can slay the ghost of Milton Friedman, we will never be able to reconcile a better purpose and better profit. And as we sort of begin to draw us to an end, I'd just like to focus on one really important thing when it comes to trust. I mean, talked about it for the past 20, 25 minutes, is that maybe trust is not the right question. The right question may be not about trust, but about trustworthiness. And it's a really important distinction. The moral philosopher, Honora O'Neill, who gave a brilliant TED talk in 2013, which was rather fittingly in the Houses of Parliament in the UK. She said that the aim to have more trust is a stupid aim, right? Actually, as a PR person or a former PR person, you wouldn't trust me anyway, just as you wouldn't trust a lawyer or you wouldn't trust an estate agent. Some people have very low levels of trust residually, and that's never going to change. But Honora went on to say, you wouldn't want more trust than the likes of Bernie Madoff, would you? You wouldn't even trust your best friend to post a letter if you knew that friend was incompetent and unreliable and had a history of forgetfulness. So we keep on saying what we want is more trust, more trust, more trust. But maybe it's not more trust. It's actually intelligently placed and intelligently refused trust. It's about trustworthiness, not trust. And trustworthiness is based on reciprocal vulnerability. And reciprocal vulnerability exposes each person, each side of the equation to the other, employees and customers and organisations. And it makes accountability very real. And I believe that, and we're doing this in work for organisations like KPMG, for a very large global leisure group, for one of the big telco companies, in creating these safe spaces where we welcome dissenting voices into the conversation, bring together people who ordinarily, in the old communications world, be standing on their respective mountaintops, shouting at each other through megaphones, and bringing them in so that these dissenting voices have safe spaces in which to find common ground and common purpose. And the results are electrifying, and I genuinely, really electrifying. So a lot of the theories in the book, when put into practice, and you see people who historically have spent the whole time in the media shouting at one another, criticising one another, condemning one another, so they're saying, actually, there is a way to find this, because actually there is no right answer, there is no right and wrong, there is no moral absolute. There's this constantly changing space which we need to navigate together. And that is where actually we as a group, as a collective at Jericho, are trying to find a difference. There's also one last anecdote about, which I suppose goes back to what I was saying about Thomas Cook. And it was a conversation that I was having with Rowan Williams, who's the former Archbishop of Canterbury and therefore the sort of the former leader of the Anglican Communion. It's not something that normally gets me because I'm an atheist, but he said that part of the problem with business, part of the problem with society is that we've become sort of literally everything is risk averse. Everything is governed by lawyers and PR people. And he said, how very annoying is it when someone says only, I'm sorry that you feel like that, when what they should be saying is, I'm just sorry, when only a proper sorry will do. And I thought that was a really important moment about how you would demonstrate reciprocal vulnerability in a relationship between a company and its stakeholders. And he went on to talk about some of the stuff that I've talked about, which is really heartening. He said, look, actually what we need to do is to root this in the common good, to root this in what we learned from Aristotle in terms of justice, tolerance, courage, fairness, wisdom, and then through the likes of Thomas Aquinas also. And then one final anecdote was from a serial non-executive director of many very large multinational corporations, and I interviewed her for the book, and I said, so how do all the organisations on whom you sit on the governance boards and remuneration committees and everything else, how do you treat ethics and values? He said, oh, we don't worry about that, we have a subcommittee that deals with that. Anyway, so in drawing to a sort of conclusion, I think that no more subcontracting of responsibilities, no more crafting messages, no more crafting narratives, no more spin, no more hiding behind lawyers or PR people, because the only agency we need is change. So if you believe, as I do, the current crisis of trust is a crisis of leadership, what we need is about responsible shareholder value, not using CSR to cloak poor behaviour. We want to talk about, as I have, profit optimization, not profit maximization, thinking in terms of public value, celebrating collaboration, not competition, finding new measures of accountability, saying sorry when you're meant to say sorry, and leading through actions, not words. And that is because the future now is all about negotiation. It's not about imposition. That old world of PR trying to impose the future, but there is, as I said, no absolute right or wrong, just this permanent state of flux. And as change agents, we can help break the status quo. I would like to think that what we're finding is a new social democracy, not just in the political sense of the word social democracy, but in thinking about social, of and among the people, and democracy giving voice to all. And on that, I will close with a quote from Tony Judt. Anyone that hasn't read his work, he sadly died at a young age, in 2010. He was one of the great philosophers, I think, of the modern era. And he said, the problem with social democracy is that there's nothing wrong with social democracy. We've just forgotten how to make the case for it. We've lost the argument. And he too took us back to Aristotle and talked about those enduring human principles of justice, tolerance, courage, and wisdom. But in it, he said, we have to just remember one thing, and I have it as a title of a chapter in my book. He said, we are, of course, all children of the Greeks. Thank you very much.